Did you know that humans hear a wide range of frequencies? We can hear as low as 20 hertz, which is lower than the lowest piano note, and we can hear as high as 20 kilohertz, which is higher than the highest note on a piccolo. Even though this is a wide range, some animals detect sounds at an even higher pitch. Dolphins and bats send and receive messages in ultrasonic frequencies, and they interpret these sounds with split-second precision. All mammals have a cochlea to amplify, detect, and convert sound waves into an electrochemical impulse. But dolphins and bats have special cochlea that detect ultrasonic frequencies. While bats live in the air and dolphins live in the water, both animals use a biological form of sonar technology called echolocation to see with sound. So a dolphin uses reflected sound waves to calculate an object's size, shape, distance, and direction of motion to find food even in murky water. And when multiple dolphins are approaching the same food source, burst-pulsed sounds ensure that the dominant dolphin gets the right-of-way and captures its food without a collision. Bats use echolocation too, but the creator tuned their equipment to work in air instead of water. They send out a pulse at 100 kilohertz that, within just a fraction of a second, can drop down to 30 kilohertz. A muscle in their middle ear contracts as the impulse is sent out, but relaxes to receive the echoes of the impulse, preventing the bats from deafening themselves. The specifications in dolphin and bat biosonar systems are so many, so well integrated, and so precise. Could they really have developed at random in two completely different environments? It stands to reason that God uniquely outfitted both of them with everything they need to thrive. For more easy-to-understand scientific evidence that confirms Genesis, check out our 12-part DVD series on the science of creation at unlockingthemysteriesofgenesis.org.
The video series that was just highlighted there, I have a set of that. It's really good. They're nice, short, 22-minute sessions. They work good for Sunday school classes. I would recommend considering that. It covers all the main areas of creation science, and it's just good material, as all of this is. I wanted to highlight a couple of things before I introduce the next speaker. There is a book that it's written. It's a new series. It's coming out for younger, I guess, children and teens. This one's written by Michael Stamp and Christy Hardy. Michael Stamp, I guess his parents attend Ascension Lutheran. Is that in the area here somewhere? Am I correct in that assumption? Towards Littleton, okay. And so I guess we have celebrities in the area, so just wanted to mention that. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I'll mention it again later, there is a youth conference, Biblical Creation Youth Conference coming up. It's going to be taking place in Aurora in 2 weeks, the 6th and the 7th at Airport Boulevard Baptist Church in Aurora. The title of it's Fearless Foundation. It's an online registration. If you think you have some teens that would be interested in attending that, the speaker, Carl Kirby, very energetic, someone who will really pick up an audience and get your teens engaged. I would encourage you to consider doing that. And it's, again, Fearless Foundation Youth Conference. I'd search for that online in that way. And that's coming up. Okay, so don't forget, again, about we only have an hour for lunch in the restaurant sheet, so that's out there if you need that information. Let me go ahead and introduce our next speaker. I feel like I'm in a relay. Okay. Our next speaker, again, Dr. Guliuzza spoke earlier, opened our conference last night. The presentation that he's doing today is continuous environmental tracking. I had the opportunity to hear, I'm pretty sure, a similar presentation about 3 years ago in Colorado Springs. It was captivating. I had been reading his material for a number of years in Acts and Facts, but when I actually heard it all put together, it really brought things to a full understanding. And so it's going to be something, if you haven't heard it before, and he touched on it a little bit during his first session last night, it's something that it's like, why didn't somebody think of that before? But it's basically bringing engineering principles to the science of how God created and designed life. And it's really a neat idea. And so with that, let's have Dr. Guliuzza come up.
Thank you very much. Wow, thank you. What a blessing it is to see all of you. The Lord has sent to ICR all of our scientists. All of them are a blessing. All of them are a joy. And Dr. Clary is a particular joy of all. You know, he used to never tease anybody until he got around me. Then he started to tease people, and now he is teasing me. So that's a real development. In fact, he's evolving right before our very eyes in these areas. Okay, what's the take-home message from Dr. Clary's talk? There's several, but if you were to come up to one person and say, I know of a research institution that is doing some research that nobody else on the planet is doing. No secular, no creationist group, none of them. They're taking borehole logs from where? All over the world by the thousands, and they are cataloging the layers that you see. And what do we find? We find evidence of a global flood because we find the same layers on how many continents? All of them in the same order. Explain that through a slow, catastrophic explanation. So what Dr. Clary is putting together is he's not just pushing back against evolution. What Dr. Clary is doing, he's giving you a better explanation to pull a bunch of observations together into a narrative that makes a lot of sense. You're finding from borehole logs, real analysis from all over the world, the same layers in the same order all over the world. That is really, really good evidence for a catastrophic worldwide flood that happened recently and happened rapidly. There's the take-home message from all of that. Now, we've been really lacking in biology. We don't have a unifying narrative. We've been doing a lot of hole punching in evolution for a long time, but we haven't come up with our own explanation of how things in biology are actually working. And I hate to say a lot of our hole punching in evolution hasn't really been effective. In fact, I hate to say our pushback against evolution has been, we accept your evolutionary narrative, it just can't do everything you claim. That has been the extent of our pushback. Everything you're saying is right about how evolution works, except it just can't do everything you say it can do. Now, is that really a good pushback? That's a cruddy pushback. We're in church, so I used cruddy. Cruddy. That's a cruddy pushback on there. I know the founder of our ministry wouldn't have even said cruddy. It's a terrible pushback. When you give away the evolutionary narrative, what you're saying, the mutations happen. What you're saying is nature's some mystical selector which can favor some and disfavor others. In other words, nature is really crafting life, but it can't just craft it as much as you say it can craft. You know what they say? Checkmate. You just gave me the game. What we're saying is, you're wrong on everything. Your narrative is wrong from the beginning. Your narrative is wrong. That's where our new evidence is coming in. Mutations aren't the mechanism, and we are going to flat out totally reject once and for all personifications of nature where you roll in a bunch of magic into your biology because you have to come up with a substitute creator because you don't want to have and acknowledge the Lord Jesus Christ. And so when you personify nature, when you project onto nature this selective ability, you are projecting onto nature intelligence and volition. Is that not what it takes to make a selection? Don't you exercise intelligence and volition when you make a selection? So when I project it onto nature, I am projecting onto nature godlike abilities. And since nature is operating everywhere, and as Darwin says, nature is scrutinizing every creature all the time, saving those things which are good, selecting those, and building with them, you have just projected onto nature agency, godlike agency, and it is flat out idolatrous. We're going to show you, good, that's right, it is. It's out. It's out. How the Lord Jesus Christ built into these creatures abilities right from the very beginning. Right from the very beginning to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. This is what he wanted them to do. So, we have a model, and we're going to go through this here. The screen is intentionally black because it's quiz time. Quiz time. Quiz time. Yesterday, I recognized the faces, so I know you were here on that. I said there was the most important part of my lecture. I want you to stop seeing creatures as what? Oh, so all of those of you who practice your lip reading said, he just said passive modeling clay. I want you to stop seeing creatures as passive modeling clay being shaped by what? Nature. Nature. And I want you to see them as active, problem-solving entities which take on environmental challenges, solve them, and fill the earth. Okay, that was the most important thing. It's going to change the way you see creatures. Then you no longer see them as what? Passive, modeling clay being shaped by nature, but you see them as these incredibly engineered entities that are active, not passive, active, problem-solving entities which take on challenges, solve them, and what? Fill the earth. Fill the earth. In order to take on those challenges, creatures must track the environment. The environment changes. The environment doesn't cause them. It detects. Oops, I give it away. It detects the change, and it self-adjusts. Therefore, in order to do that, all adaptable things must have three key elements. Those elements are what? To detect, you must have a sensor. You know what evolutionists call them? Receptors. Why do they call them receptors? Because they see organisms as what? Passive. But what they really are is they're active sensors. I wish I had $1,000 because I'd be a multimillionaire every time I read in evolutionary literature, the receptor detected. The receptor sensed. Because that's what it is. It's really a sensor. Next, they must have what? Innate logic. If, then logic. If you detect this, then deploy this, and they have to have output responses. All right, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to bring about a highly engineered with multiple parts working together for a purpose to talk about creatures engineered adaptability. Creatures engineered adaptability. Now, we're all adaptable. Did you notice that when Dr. Clary was speaking, he was running out of gas? That's because he had COVID and he hasn't fully recovered yet. He had a really bad case of COVID. I thought he was going to really be sick and almost be with the Lord. I got COVID and I haven't fully recovered yet either. So both of us kind of like, when we used to be able to talk on one massive breath, we're kind of gasping for air a little bit because neither one of us have fully recovered. This is what creatures are doing. We're trying to recover. We have an engineered adaptability. ICR has put together a model which describes how organisms adapt. They continuously track what? The environment. It's a descriptive term. It's not magical like natural selection or artificial selection. By the way, when people use a real brain and really select, evolutionists call that artificial. They get everything 100% backwards, 100% backwards. And I want to talk about one specific area because I want to bring something new that even if you're a creationist veteran for 50 years, and some of you are here, something that you haven't heard before, I want to talk about anticipatory systems. So systems which allow organisms to anticipate things in advance, or to put it in a very plain way, adapting today for tomorrow's challenges. Now that is cool. That is really cool. In fact, that's so super cool, human engineers can't even really do it yet. There's a lot of cool things that human engineers can do, but they're not really good at this. Adapting when? Today for what? Tomorrow's challenges. Wow, that would really be cool, because this answers what we ought to do, how we ought to do things. Now you see this young gal here, she's facing a fork in the road. Should she go to the right or should she go to the left? You know what would help her make a decision? Is if she could see what? Well, not the future, in the picture, in the picture, in the picture. If she could see, if she was God, she could see in the future. But in real life, in the picture, if she could see what? What's over the hill. You see, if she could just see. I got rid of that other pointer. I went back to my old-fashioned pointer. If she could just see what's over there, if she could just see what's there, it would really help her make a decision. Should she go to the right or should she go to the left? This is what anticipatory systems enable creatures to do. It's not, they don't get to see into the future, but they kind of anticipate what's coming up the road. They kind of like get to look over the hill, so to speak. This is a really, really highly engineered and really cool mechanism. Engineers try to do this. In 2006, New Horizons, it's an interplanetary probe, was launched, Cape Kennedy. In it circled multiple planets, circled around the Earth, picking up speed, circled other planets, picking up speed, and whoosh, was sent out towards the end of the solar system, and in 2015, rendezvoused with Pluto. How many miles away? 3 billion miles. That's almost mind-boggling to imagine it. And it has to keep track of where it is, where Pluto is. The engineers at NASA kind of had nudged it along the way. But still, is this an engineering marvel? You hit Pluto 3 billion miles away, many years into the future. That is anticipatory planning. And if that wasn't enough, it circled around Pluto, picked up some more speed, and flew out to 2019, another billion miles, and rendezvoused with a rock that was 22 miles across. 22 miles across. 22 a billion. I mean, you're talking a fraction of a degree, and it rendezvoused with it. That is anticipatory planning. That is incredible type of planning. You know what? Creatures can do the same thing. Here we have a little dragonfly. It wants to eat this moth. When it gets close enough, it doesn't just run down the moth and just by brute speed just overpower it. It makes a plan of where the moth is going to be. It plans out where it's going to be, and boom, it goes on an anticipatory trajectory and intercepts the moth. The same way that interplanetary probe intercepted Pluto. And it's using the same mechanisms. And this is what the paper shows. By the way, I put all these papers in all of them. For those who are real purists, I want you to know where the scientific paper is that I got everything from in this particular case. And this paper says this: evidence of internal models in dragonfly behavior suggests use of a predictive model of the prey's trajectory and a copy of the dragonfly's own motor commands. This dragonfly, with its tiny little dragonfly brain, is making a predictive model inside of it. Something that human engineers are struggling to do. In fact, predictive models are some of the hardest things for human engineers to do. Here's one predictive model: economic outlook. People are trying to figure out what's going to happen to the economy into the future, so they make these economic models on that. One thing you know, if Biden's president, no, never mind, sorry, just teasing on all of that. I'm just teasing on there. I can tell the Biden supporter, he's like, on there. How do you predict what the economy is going to be doing 6 months from now? And here's an even harder one. Look at this. This is a forecasting model for the weather. A week from now, what's going to be happening here? You want an accurate one. These are hard models to put together. In fact, these are not just reactive, these are proactive models, which flow from a logic-based system. Logic-based systems, and when they're in creatures, they give creatures foresight of what they ought to do and how they ought to self-adjust to predicted external conditions which are coming. And they may be coming the next day, they may be coming a month, they may be coming a year from now, but they are giving these abilities to like forecast what's going to be happening and adjust today for those kinds of things. In other words, when creatures self-adjust and when they adapt, it is not just reactive, but it is incredibly proactive. Now, would you expect anything less from the Lord Jesus, who is going to build something into his creatures to continuously attract environments, to not just always be reacting, but to be proactive in advance so that they can adjust as necessary? So I want to go through very quickly, because we have 3 parts to this talk. I want to show you some examples of how they do it. I want to discuss how it works. I want to give you some predictions of what I expect to find when we finally reverse engineer the biology and figure out what's happening on all of this. This is totally new. Nobody's doing this. Nobody's doing this in the creationists. Nobody's even doing this amongst the secularists. But I want to give you some examples. So obviously, we want to start with all kinds of creatures, plants, and this is one, tomato plants. And they were exposing tomato plants to a creature, I think it was a slug in this case, that would eat the tomato plants. And this is what they found in these papers. New research now shows that some flora can detect an herbivorous animal. What's herbivorous? One that eats a plant. Well before it launches an assault, letting a plant mount a preemptive defense that even works against other pests. Wow. The plant isn't even attacked, but it says, I think I'm going to get attacked. And so it starts to make its defenses. And in this experiment, as they start out, none of the plants were actually ever attacked. The lead investigator said, we just gave them cues that suggested an attack was coming. What was the cue? Slug slime. Slug slime. They could detect the slug slime. That's better than looking at the monkey butts that Dr. Thomas was talking about here. Slug slime. We gave them cues that suggested an attack was coming, and that was enough to trigger big changes in their chemistry. Wow, not just big changes in their chemistry, but optimized changes in their chemistry. It says that when they exposed them to this, they were able to generate a defensive response in plants that have not been attacked. And plants integrate the many sources of information regarding attack in their environment to optimize investment in their defenses. So not only are you seeing preemptive ability, you're seeing abilities within the plants to even optimize. Should I spend my resources making this, or should I spend my resources making the defensive things? And not only was it optimized in this area, it went on to say this in the paper, that this enabled the plants to prioritize risk information, whereby information that is likely linked with greater imminent risk triggers a stronger defense. Wow. It's as if the plants are able to what? Think. Think. Now, when have you heard this before? You haven't. This is a proactive, not a reactive, a proactive response, where they are prioritizing their resources in order to defend themselves against this coming attack, which is coming. And it's happening in plants. Not only does it happen in plants, but it even happens in honeybees. Here's a little bee right here. My wife took a picture of this on her marigolds. And many of these experiments are going to have to do with starvation. You starve the animal during development, and you see what happens when it grows into adult. And in this experiment, they starved the honeybees when they didn't starve them to death, but they greatly limited their intake when they're larvae, when they're developing, and they wanted to see what happened to them when they were adult. And it went on to say this, that most organisms, not just honeybees, most organisms are constantly faced with environmental changes and stressors. In diverse organisms, there is an anticipatory mechanism during development that can program adult phenotypes. Those are the adult traits. The adult phenotype would be adapted to the predicted environment that occurred during the organism's maturation. In other words, if you're exposed to starvation while you're developing, there's a good chance you may be exposed to starvation when what? You're adult, when you're growing. So it's preparing you even while you're developing to face an environment in which you may be starved. And you can prepare for that in advance. And this is what they found. The adaptive phenotypic changes, those are their traits, are induced across the board. Physiological, molecular, and even behavioral changes are seen in these honeybees. And they found this, that surprisingly, we found that short-term starvation in the larval stage makes adult honeybees more adaptive to adult starvation. This suggests that they have an anticipatory mechanism just like solitary animals do. In other words, bees are a group type of creature. How does it work? Are individual bees starvation resistant? The answer was yes. Not just the hive, but individual bees. So in other words, when they're starved as a young larval development, that as they get older, they're more resistant and more resilient to starvation, even as adults. What about cross-generational anticipatory systems? Now this is really cool, because this isn't even starvation of the larvae of an individual bee. It's not even a plant. This is you expose mom or dad to a condition, and offspring is getting prepared for that condition. That's really cool. How many of you like the picture of this lion with a little cub there? Do animals have emotions? Oh, you better believe they do. They're very conscious. Very, very conscious in that. And she loves her little cub right there. How does it happen? Well, here's a cool paper that was on error management dealing with these transgenerational effects. And they said this: changes in the parental phenotype, that is, mom or dad's traits, can act as a signal to offspring about the future environment that they will encounter. And these parental cues can induce adaptive plasticity and offspring characteristics. Adaptive transgenerational phenotypic plasticity, or adaptive parental effects. They always have to give a long, complicated names to things. Let me make one thing clear. These biologists don't understand engineering because they don't want to understand engineering. If they understood engineering, they could get their explanations clearer and more accurate. You are an individual. You're even an individual compared to your parents. Your parents are your parents. You are you. You are a distinct, autonomous individual, even though you've got your arm on your lovely wife. You're two separate beings. Mom, when that baby is developing in you, it is a separate human being. It's a separate human being. Mom, you cannot change the baby as it's developing. You cannot get in there and directly change it. Baby starts from a single cell and baby self-constructs. Baby self-constructs. What mom can do, mom can act as a sensor of the environment. Mom can send information in, but mom cannot directly change baby's DNA. Mom can send information in, and then baby, as a separate organism, can detect mom's information, bring it into itself, and adjust itself. Does that make sense? In other words, there's no magic where mom reaches in and changes it. There has to be an engineered system. Mom sends data. Baby must have a what? A sensor for mom's data. A sensor for mom's data, and then baby adjusts itself. That is how you get two separate entities to work together. I know, because that's how engineers build them. And that's how it works. So, this is what we're going to discuss in these changes. It goes on to say this: however, maternal stress can play adaptive roles across wide varieties of animal taxa if stress-induced phenotypes better prepare offspring for a stressful postnatal environment. In what kinds of animals? Mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Does that seem like it's pretty comprehensive? Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive that parents can do this. Well, here's an interesting one. We'll start out with a pretty basic creature, very highly complicated, a sea urchin. And these researchers are worried about global warming. In fact, a lot of really good research comes out of the fact that many scientists, are scared to death of global warming. So they want to know what's going to happen to creatures if the environment changes. And in this particular case, they're wondering if the ocean pH changes, if the ocean temperature changes, if those changes in the ocean become stressful, what are creatures like sea urchins going to do? And so they did research on this. And they found that transgenerational plasticity in situ could act as an important mechanism by which, hey, look at this, by which populations might keep pace with rapid environmental changes. That sounds like a model that ICR's put together called continuous environmental what? Tracking. If you're going to keep pace with environmental changes, you're doing what? You're tracking them. You're tracking them. So they're saying the same thing, they're just not using the exact identical words. But what they want to know is, can creatures track environmental changes? Can they keep up with them? And they found out yes. And here are the two researchers, Wong and Hoffman. And what they discovered, here's a sea urchin. This is the little eggs that she's going to release into the water. What they discovered was more dramatic than they ever expected. And they put together this great little summary paragraph. Those two gals said, it's almost like the female could sense that her progeny were about to be released into some challenging conditions for early stage development. In response, she primed her offspring and gave them tools to face stressful conditions. It's like she packed them a backpack of tools. Wow, that's quite remarkable. And she's able to do this because she can affect the eggs, because mom is making the eggs, so she can directly affect the eggs. And so she's priming the eggs with different characteristics to be released into the environment. She's giving them a backpack of tools. It sounds like the Lord Jesus Christ knew about these things, and he wanted the creatures to be prepared for the changes that were coming. Here's another one on little nematode, a tiny little worm called C. elegans. And in this particular case, they starved mom, and they wanted to find out what would happen in her offspring. And this is what they found. Information from a mother's environment can be transmitted to her offspring. We describe a genetic network that mediates effects of a mother's diet on the size and starvation resistance of her offspring. Mom is in a starved condition, and now her offspring are better able to live in low food environments. They wanted to say this: fitness consequences of maternal effects hinge on anticipation of conditions. The thrifty phenotype, stop right there, because this is an important concept that comes up over and over and over again, and I'll explain it to you. The thrifty phenotype, or thrifty traits. Does everybody know what thrifty means? When you're thrifty, you're very what? Cheap. Oh, man. Oh, man. Yeah, okay, efficient, cheap. Okay, here's a gal who has money. Here's a guy who has no money. And nobody gives it to him either, because they're what? Cheap. So, well, there you go. Two different interpretations of thrifty. Okay, how about if I just say frugal? Okay, you're frugal. So what that's basically saying is, parents are in an environment where they're going to be starved. They pass on traits to their offspring, which makes them what? Thrifty with their calories. Thrifty with the use of their calories. And some people call them calorie hoarders. So the offspring are born, and when they get their calories, they don't just blow them. They're very what? Thrifty, and they hoard the calories because they don't know if they're not going to be starved. Does that make sense? So that's the thrifty phenotype. The thrifty phenotype hypothesis proposes that children of mothers malnourished during pregnancy are programmed to store more energy in anticipation of limited nutrient availability through maternal metabolic programming and anticipation of external conditions in progeny. The paper goes on to say, obviously research was done at Duke. These animals, the offspring, are able to anticipate adverse conditions based on their mother's experience. Mom somehow provisions the embryo or programs it. Mom can provision the eggs, but can mom change the programming of the embryo? No. Mom can't do that to the embryo. Mom's contribution is in the production of the eggs, and then after that, sending information that the embryo can use in that particular case. So they have to they could be a little more precise in their explanation, but the idea is there. Babies are born with traits that they're going to live in this starvation environment. Here's another one. Let's move to some mammals here, obviously on a sheep. From this paper, the effects of undernutrition in utero on reproductive function in adult male and female sheep. So in this particular case, they took mom, the female sheep. They have to abide by rules, so they can't torture the animals, but they can give them a very low diet. And so mom, while she is pregnant with these sheep, she is fed just the minimum amount of food. And they want to see what the effects are in male and female offspring when they become adults. Does that make sense? So that's what they're looking for. They're going to follow these offspring to see what happens to them when they face starvation environments, when they become adults, if mom was in a starvation environment while she was pregnant for them. So that's what the experiment's about. And this is what they found. As adults, semen quality, obviously this is talking to males, at 20 months of age was unaffected by prenatal undernutrition. So in this particular case, in terms of their reproductive efforts, males' reproductive effect was not affected. However, with the females, it was a different story. But ovulation rate was significantly reduced in L, that was the low nutrition, compared to the H, high nutrition offspring. So what happened to reproductive rates in adult females? It went down. Does that make sense? Why would it make sense? Because mom's in a starvation environment, therefore offspring might be in a starvation environment. Therefore, what do you want to happen to the population of your group? Do you want it to go up or down? You want it to go down. Therefore, reproductive effect on females went down. It sounds like somebody knows how these things work and programmed it right in advance. Right in advance in this particular case. How about humans? Any effect on humans, cross-generational effect? Well, yes. There's multiple studies on this. How many like that picture? Isn't that a great picture? That's another one. Moms love their kids too, in that case. This one was a study done in Norway, and with some Polish researchers on it, and they used the words fat babies and skinny babies. So that's not my words. That's the words that they used in this paper. They called them fat babies and skinny babies. And they're looking to test their hypothesis, which is the predictive adaptive response hypothesis, which sounds a lot like continuous environmental tracking. They want to know if they have a predictive adaptive response. And so it's hard to do experiments on humans, so you have to kind of like go back and do some retrospective analysis. So they looked at a bunch of babies, and they compared birth weights. And they looked at heavy babies, which they called fat babies, versus lightweight babies, which are skinny babies. They're assuming that the fat babies had a lot of nutrition. Mom had a lot of nutrition while she was pregnant. Therefore, she produced fat babies. And skinny babies were the result of the fact that mom was undernourished or had less nourishment and therefore had smaller babies. Then what do you think they want to do? They want to track the babies through time. In this particular case, they're only going to look at the women, only going to look at the females, and they want to see what happens to them as adults when they are put in low nutrition, high work environments. Wow, what an experiment, a long-range experiment. So that's what they did. They went and they took a whole plethora of women and they gave them less food. They gave some of them less food, and they worked them really hard. They gave them, as it says in the paper, more housework to do. This wasn't an American study, obviously. So they gave them more housework to do, and they gave them less food. And then they checked what happens to their estrogen levels compared to controls. And then they looked at whether they were fat or skinny when they were born, and they compared all of these things. Wow, this is kind of a complicated study. And this is what they found. The central claim of the predictive adaptive response hypothesis is that developmental changes that are associated with energy constraints on fetal growth are essentially adaptive, preparing the organism for a predicted range of environment it's likely to encounter as an adult in life. And they found that the levels of estradiol, that's estrogen, in women born with the highest neonatal nutritional status were 37 and 46% higher, respectively, than levels of estradiol born in the lower status. What is that saying? That's saying that women who were put in these stressful conditions, who were fat babies, had higher responses, had basically more reproductive effect, higher levels of estrogen, than the babies who were skinny babies put in the same conditions. So the overall effect on reproduction for skinny babies when put in stressful conditions is that they went where? It went down, just as it did in the sheep. Wow, that was really a complicated study. There was another one that was done on men in the Philippines, and they were also checking on birth weight and size and testosterone production as they got older, and aggressiveness. And they also checked whether they attracted more females or less females. It was a great study on all of this, on that, and they found that male babies who were bigger and had a large birth weight had a higher production of testosterone and were, on average, more attractive to females than the lower, skinnier ones. By the way, I was a 9-pound baby. So, on that, so I think this study is confirmed on all of that. All right. The next study has a really, really long title, but I'll give you the background for it because I just want to give you the results. Unfortunately, in China, about 1959 to 1964, they had one of their 5-year plans in China where they were going to change the effects of agriculture. Unfortunately, like many of their 5-year plans, it didn't boost agricultural production, it had it plummet. And between 1959 and 1964, about 40 million Chinese people starved to death. 40 million. This explains when I was a kid, and I was growing up in the 60s, my mom always said to me, "Eat everything on your plate, there's starving children in China." And I'm like, this meant nothing to me. Now I'm 60 years old, it's like, oh, now I know what my mom was saying. There's starving children in China. Eat everything on your plate. And there. What happened? Well, this provided a natural laboratory because they were able to follow the children of parents who obviously didn't starve to death, but were in severe starvation conditions in cities versus the children of parents who migrated to the city who were not starved. And they were able to follow the effects of children whose parents, mom was starved, or dad was starved, or mom and dad were starved, what the effects of that were to them versus children whose parents weren't starved in the same city as time went on. And guess what they found? This was, we'll skip on this right there. They found that prenatal exposure to famine, that means that your parents were being starved while you were in your mother's womb, prenatal exposure, the odds of developing hyperglycemia were about 2 to 1 in both children and grandchildren, and the probability of developing type 2 diabetes in the children of starved parents was 75% higher compared to those offspring whose parents were not starved. Why do you think that could be? So let's start connecting our dots. If the children are born to starved parents, they probably have what? The thrifty phenotype, which means they become calorie hoarders. They tend to hoard their calories. And so, because they're anticipating being born in a starvation environment. But they did not grow up in a starvation environment. They did not grow up in a calorie deficient environment. They grew up in an abundant, calorie abundant environment. Therefore, their phenotype to store and hoard calories led to them developing hyperglycemia and diabetes faster, because there was a mismatch of the environment that they were anticipated to grow up in versus what they really did grow up in. And they've tracked the same effect with Americans. Same effect with Americans. Baby boomers who were born to parents between the late 1940s and the early 1960s also tended to have the thrifty calorie deficient, thrifty phenotype. But Americans who had less food in the 50s but grew up in the 70s had more food. In other words, you went from a hamburger that was this size in the 60s to one that was what? This size in the 70s. Wow, that's really kind of interesting. Well, how in the world does all of this happen? How are we going to explain these things? What are the mechanisms for it? Well, evolutionists have their mechanisms to try to explain things that are happening all around them. In fact, their perceptions really had to change, because initially they thought that the small brains of insects and other invertebrates are often thought to constrain these animals entirely in the moment. In other words, their tiny brain only lets them live what? Right for the instant. But that's not true. We actually found that even with insects, that they have foresight. We propose a basic form of foresight. The ability to predict the outcome of one's own actions is at the heart of such behavioral flexibility. Well, their substitute God, the natural selector, he's going to act like God, but he's not going to do it as a real engineer would do, because that would sound a lot too much like design. So your good bud here that all of you recognize, Richard Dawkins, says that natural selection, notice what he says about natural selection. The blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, he didn't discover, he invented, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence of apparently purposeful forms of all life. Oh, what did natural selection do? It brought about the apparently purposeful forms of all life. It created everything, but it has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all, according to Richard Dawkins, talking about his personification in nature. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, said, I suspect that some people also dislike the idea that natural selection has no foresight. The process itself, in effect, does not know where to go. It is the environment that provides the direction. And over the long run, its effects are largely unpredictable in detail. Then the world's leading researchers on lizards, Jonathan Loso, says, you must remember that natural selection has no foresight. It will not favor a mutation because it will be useful in the future. So what they're trying to say is this substitute God doesn't act like a real engineer. It uses random broken things like mutation, and it doesn't even have a plan. It has no foresight. It just ambles along and cobbles creatures together. In other words, they want to push back against any idea that anybody would have that when you look at creatures, they were really engineered and designed. Because they want to use all the anti-design language that they could possibly muster. Random, no foresight, no plan, no purpose, nothing. All of that is so they can condition those college students, which Dr. Thomas was talking to the other night, so they say no plan, no purpose, no engineering, no design. This is what you need to see. Darwin was not there to explain the diversity of life on Earth. Darwin was there to explain the design of life on Earth, which was the eminent testimony to God. And he wanted a substitute agent to do it. And that's why all of this language about no purpose, no plan, no foresight, random, mutation, broken, blah, 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 chokes evolutionary literature. That's why. It's to push back against any notion of a creator. Anyway, what these guys would have you believe is this totally blind process, which is somehow driven by death, where one animal builds itself on the backs of the death and the extinction of so many others. This death-driven worldview, with no purpose, no desire, no consciousness, no foresight, somehow crafted creatures by the jillions that show overwhelming purpose, overwhelming desires. They have consciousness, they have foresight, and they have anticipation. Does that make any sense? No sense. In fact, it's incoherent. It's illogical and it is irrational. And our unseen enemy chuckles his head off when he gets people to say such nonsense and to believe such nonsense. That's what's really happening. And that's why we need to push back against it. So, we need to do biology as if Darwin had never been born. That's not my statement, that's Paul Nelson's, but I love it. So if we're going to do biology as if Darwin had never been born, what we need to do is replace back into biology what Darwin took out. In other words, Darwin went from looking at, before Darwin, looking at what creatures could do, looking at their internal innate capabilities, to what he said is, let's look at the environment, of how the environment is shaping and molding creatures. We need to go back as if Darwin is not there and start looking back again into the internal capabilities of organisms and then begin to explain it as it really is, as an engineered system. Actually, it's an engineered system made up of many, many, many systems. This is what we can do. And when we bring this engineered adaptability approach back into biology, we will rid biology of all of the magical language which chokes evolutionary literature. We will bring some clarity of thought. We'll bring some cohesiveness and explanation, which is totally lacking. So how would we do that? Well, this car right here is adaptable. It has sensors, speed sensors. It has a computer. It has output responses. Creatures are going to do the same thing. But there's more to it than just that. We need to go back right from the very beginning and change our thinking about why adaptation happens. The dominant creationist teaching, which has been about for many years, is that adaptation is a response to the fall. After the fall, creatures needed to adapt. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Right from the very beginning, the Bible says there were conditions that were dynamic. The Bible says right from the beginning that there were day and night cycles. Does that make the earth a dynamic place? The Bible says that there were going to be seasons, and we're going to mark those seasons by the stars. Do seasons make the earth a dynamic place? The Bible said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. When one creature goes in and fills a niche where other creatures are, does that make it dynamic for those creatures? So if I came in and I filled your niche, I would change your niche. For the better, of course. But I would change your niche. I would change your niche on all of that. But the Bible also says, so the Bible says that the earth was dynamic, but the Bible also says creatures reproduce after their kind. If I'm going to look at this from an engineering perspective, I'm going to see evidences of something that engineers would call robustness. In other words, these organisms, even though they're facing dynamic environments, are going to maintain certain basic elements. They can take a licking and keep on ticking. They're robust, but they're also going to have some plastic elements, which means that they can flex. They can change with some of these environmental changes, all within limits. Definite design parameters are going to affect them. So they must be robust and they must be plastic, which from an engineering perspective, we would call resilient. These are highly resilient creatures, and these are design characteristics. So when the Lord made these creatures, he made them robust, he made them plastic, he made them resilient, right from the very beginning of creation, in order to live on a highly dynamic earth. Why? Why? Because highly dynamic things are glorious. Highly dynamic things express incredible engineering prowess. Highly dynamic things show the genius of the person who made it. All of this is for the Lord's glory, to show us. He doesn't make a table, say, wow, I'm a great engineer, I made this table. He makes something that makes a human cruise control look utterly simple. He says, this is how great I am. Boom! I'll make creatures that can live at the bottom of the ocean. I'll make creatures that can live miles underground. I'll do all kinds of things with these creatures. So, what creatures seem to do is they seem to be able to anticipate and predict these environmental changes, which leads to not random but highly purposeful adaptations. How they do it is by many, many, many innate systems which enable them to self-adjust. And why do they do it? Why do they continually track environments? So they can maintain their homeostasis. That's a word that goes back to 8th grade biology. Maintain their homeostasis. What, how, and why they're doing it. So, if creatures are really engineered, then engineering not only can be informed by biology, but engineering can inform biology. Therefore, I'm looking for corresponding system elements between a human engineered thing, some workmanship here that is doing a function, and creatures which are doing similar functions. So this car is a totally autonomous car. It has all kinds of what? What are these things? Sensors. And guess what's inside of it? Computers doing what? Logic. And it can drive itself from San Francisco, if it had a big enough gas tank, to New York City, going around hazards, going around bad weather, going around all kinds of things. Well, these guinea pigs do the same thing. Guinea pigs beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA. They took these male guinea pigs, okay, the males are back on the hot seat, in this case literally, and they put these male guinea pigs in cages with a heating pad on the bottom of it to mimic climate change. Well, if you know anything about male guinea pig anatomy, what's sitting on the hot plate? It is. And they roasted them for 70 days, a long enough time to make one cycle of sperm. They mated these male guinea pigs with female guinea pigs, which were not in hot conditions. They looked at the pups. Lo and behold, the pups have modifications to the expression of at least 18 different genes that enable them to live in a hotter environment. One generation. Do you think these male guinea pigs have a temperature sensor? Do you think they have logic? Do you think they have output? Of course. So we're looking for corresponding system elements on top of that. We're looking for the sensors that are all over your cells, all over your body. We're looking for innate logic, which we find in the nucleus and other places, and we're looking for appropriate adjustments all across the board. Therefore, if we want to approach biology from an engineering standpoint, knowing how design things operate, that would be so good if every biologist had to take Engineering 101. If every biologist had to take Engineering 101 to learn how engineered things operate, we would get much better explanations in biology. Here's the obvious question. Why aren't biologists sent to Engineering 101? Because they don't believe it was what? Engineered. That's why they don't go to it. But I'm suggesting knowing how designed things operate can greatly inform our understanding of how living things operate. We would do it faster, we would do it more efficiently, we would do it with less cost. And that, just like this space shuttle, as I mentioned last night, which is going to traverse through all of the different environments, has its solutions built in right from the beginning, we should expect the same thing in creatures, that they will have their solutions built in right up front. Therefore, prediction time. When it comes time to figure out how these anticipatory systems work, what am I predicting? Well, one thing is this. Their capacity, just like the capacity on anything, is going to be fully internal. I'm not saying 99%, I'm saying 100%. 100% of the ability of these anticipatory systems is going to be found within the organisms, highly regulated by control systems. Not the environment. In the organism, control systems regulating it. Pre-designed. How much capacity? All of it. All of it. An organism will relate to its environment by its built-in control systems. That's a prediction of what we're going to find. This man here, he's passed away. He was, at the time, the world's leading researcher on anticipatory systems. He did a good job of describing what one was. He says, an anticipatory system is a natural system that contains, okay, this is really good, an internal predictive model of itself and its environment. That is really cool. That means it has an internal system that can model what? Itself and model what? Its environment. It's modeling them both, and it's where? Inside. Inside. Which allows it to change state in what? An instant, in accord with the model's predictions pertaining to a later instant. So it's making a model which is predicting what's going to happen in the future, but it's changing itself now. That is really cool. That's what an anticipatory system is. So, are we going to find this within creatures? Yes. Based on this research that they had done, they found that locusts, grasshoppers, dragonflies, and flies seem to use what? Internal models of the surrounding world to tailor their actions adaptively to predict the imminent future. Where are the models? Nobody knows. But I'm predicting they're going to be there. And on top of that, evidence of an internal model at the neural circuit level has also been shown in fruit flies. These examples highlight an important aspect of internal models whereby the state of the system should modulate the processing of sensory information. So where might we turn to look for things that we're going to find? Well, if we know how man-made things work, maybe it'll give us a clue about the biology. Well, here's one. Humans have put together systems to model the weather. Well, if we were to look at one of these weather models, we would find 4 things in a weather model. First, somebody, probably some physicist, came up with mathematical equations characterizing the physics of natural phenomenon. In other words, they studied clouds and they made up physical models in math to model what clouds do, wind does, humidity does, temperature does. All of these things, some physicist reduced what's happening in nature to these mathematical models. Second, all over the world, they put up weather stations which gather data from diverse sensors. 3, they store in data banks what has happened in the weather in the past. And then 4, they put together these incredible equations which are able, as they say, to step forward in time and establish initial conditions. So they've got the models, they've got the real-time data that they're collecting, they've got all the historical data that they've stored up, and they're putting it together and they're predicting what's going to happen next week. Okay, what am I predicting are going to be in creatures? Guess what they think? They're going to have these things. I predict that when we reverse engineer these creatures and we start to really figure out what's happening in their anticipatory systems, we're going to find programs, equations. We know that they have sensors, which are taking in data all the time. I'll bet we're going to find there's some stored reference information, and there's mechanisms which enable them to step forward in time. There you go. I say creationists don't make predictions. These are predictions. In fact, not only the predictions, if ICR had the money and we had the staff, I would say this would be a great research program, wouldn't it? This would be a wonderful research program. So it's telling us what we're going to do. And it would show how organisms continuously track environmental changes, not only in real time, but proactively, giving creatures a foresight from their anticipatory mechanisms, which becomes input for other systems, which guides them during development, their physiology, or their behavioral actions. That's what anticipatory systems are. And that's going to explain why tomatoes and honeybees and all these other creatures can do what they're doing. Because the Lord has never left us without direction. Amen? Amen. Where can you find more information on all of this in case you can't remember everything I said on that? I know, that's highly unlikely. Well, sign up for this magazine. This is really, really good. It's free. It'll keep you informed. Acts and Facts. Acts and Facts. Sorry, I thought that was like, I thought that was understood on that. And guess what? You can be frugal and get this magazine because it is absolutely free on that. Okay, if you want a DVD covering a lot of what I said, here it is, Replacing Darwin's Sacred Imposter. And that it'll cover everything. This is only about 40 minutes long. Two books. You want to explain design to your friends. Clearly Seen, Constructing Solid Arguments for Design. This is a how-to book. It's a how-to book with questions in the back to train yourself. How do you explain the engineering in creatures that you see to your friends in order to witness to your friends? That's what this book covers. It's a how-to book on that. And this book, as was mentioned last night, Made in His Image, it's a smaller version of it, covers 14 systems of how all of the parts must be together at the right place at the right time in order for them to work. If you want to explain some creatures by design, this tiny little booklet right there goes through multiple design features on the creatures by design. And then finally, we need a good offense and a good defense. If you want to punch holes in some evolutionary thinking, this booklet covers 22 major blunders that the evolutionists did that were based on their total imagination. They imagine things, therefore they make a blunder. So this would be a way, this is not 20 evolutionary blunders, but there's more in there than just the 20 evolutionary blunders right here. It's got the human and the chimp on the front. Well, thank you so very much for your time, and I'll turn it back over to the moderator.